As twilight gathers and the day's activity softens into stillness, we turn our attention to a life that carved an indelible path through the latter half of the 20th century. Tonight, we will journey through the long and consequential existence of Margaret Hilda Thatcher, a figure whose presence, even in quiet reflection, evokes a profound sense of her historical weight. Her name alone conjures images of an era defined by significant shifts, both within the United Kingdom and across the broader global landscape. We begin not with the clamour of political debate, nor the urgency of policy decisions, but with a gentle invitation to simply observe. Our purpose is to trace the intricate tapestry of a life lived with unwavering conviction, from its nascent beginnings in a modest Lincolnshire town to its eventual culmination on the world stage. We seek to understand the trajectory of a woman who, through sheer force of will and intellect, rose to become a singular force in British politics, leaving an enduring imprint that continues to be examined and discussed. This narrative will unfold deliberately, allowing each phase of her journey to emerge with a quiet clarity. There will be no rush to judgment, no heightened drama, only the steady presentation of events and circumstances that shaped her path and, in turn, were shaped by her. We will move through the years as one might traverse a long, winding road at dusk, noticing the details, absorbing the atmosphere, and allowing the story to reveal itself in its own measured time. Prepare to simply listen, to absorb the quiet chronicle of a life of extraordinary impact, allowing the gentle rhythm of the unfolding history to guide you. Our journey into the formative years of Margaret Thatcher begins in the quiet market town of Grantham, nestled within the gentle undulations of Lincolnshire. It was here, in the autumn of 1925, that Margaret Hilda Roberts entered the world. Grantham, in the interwar period, was a place of measured rhythms and predictable routines, a typical English provincial town where life unfolded with a certain understated dignity. The high street, with its array of independent shops, served as the town's commercial heart. The scent of fresh bread from the bakeries mingled with the earthy aroma of produce from local farms, carried on the occasional breeze. Conversations in the butcher's shop or by the greengrocer's stall would often revolve around local affairs, the weather, and the familiar ebb and flow of daily existence. It was a place where community ties were strong, and individual reputations were slowly but surely forged over many years. Houses built from the local brick lined the residential streets, each with its small garden, a testament to the quiet aspiration for domestic order. Children played in the parks, their distant laughter a soft counterpoint to the gentle hum of town life. Life in Grantham for many was a steady progression, marked by the changing seasons and the traditional calendar of market days and church services. Yet, beneath this outwardly tranquil surface, the subtle undercurrents of the wider world were beginning to stir. The echoes of the Great War, though fading, still resonated in the lives of many families. The nascent technologies of radio and cinema were slowly bringing distant events closer, expanding horizons beyond the immediate confines of the town. While Grantham maintained its sense of insularity, it was not entirely immune to the larger forces shaping Britain, forces that would eventually profoundly impact the young girl growing up within its quiet embrace. It was within this specific context, a blend of tradition and nascent change, that the early foundations of Margaret Roberts' character began to form. Central to Margaret's early world, and indeed to her developing character, was the profound influence of her father, Alfred Roberts. He was a man of firm principles and tireless dedication, a grocer by trade and a pillar of the Grantham community. The family lived above their shop, a constant immersion in the rhythms of commerce and customer interaction. From an early age, Margaret observed the meticulous management of stock, the careful balancing of accounts, and the unwavering commitment to serving the local populace. Alfred Roberts embodied the values of Methodism, a faith that emphasized personal responsibility, self-improvement, and a strong moral compass. These tenets were not merely abstract beliefs, but living principles that shaped his daily actions. He instilled in his daughters a deep respect for hard work, frugality, and the importance of individual effort. Sundays were observed with solemnity, and the family attended Finkin Street Methodist Church, where Alfred often preached. His sermons were known for their clarity, their conviction, and their direct appeal to common sense and ethical conduct. Beyond his business, Alfred was deeply committed to public service, a calling he pursued with characteristic diligence. He served as local councillor for many years, eventually becoming the mayor of Grantham. In these roles he championed local causes, debated town policies, and worked to improve the lives of his fellow citizens. His approach to public life was characterized by a practical, no-nonsense attitude, a belief in sound financial management, and a steadfast dedication to what he perceived as the public good. These early observations of her father's methodical approach to business, his unwavering faith, and his tireless engagement in community governance would leave an indelible mark on Margaret. The principles of self-reliance, the conviction in one's beliefs, and the disciplined application of effort, so evident in Alfred Roberts, would later emerge as defining characteristics in his daughter's own remarkable trajectory. While the public influence of Alfred Roberts was widely acknowledged, the quieter, yet no less essential, presence of Beatrice Roberts anchored the family's domestic world. Beatrice's role was primarily focused on the meticulous running of the household and the practical support of the family's grocery business. Hers was a life defined by the continuous demands of home and shop, a steady rhythm of chores, cooking, and careful management. The Roberts' home above the shop was a nexus of activity, where the domestic sphere seamlessly intertwined with the commercial. Beatrice oversaw the daily routines, ensuring the smooth operation of both. Her days were filled with the preparation of meals, and the maintenance of the living quarters, and the myriad tasks required to support a family in a busy shop. This was an era when household management was a demanding undertaking, without the conveniences that would later become commonplace. Every meal, every clean garment, every tidy room represented a significant investment of time and effort. Beatrice's influence, though perhaps less overtly articulated than her husband's, was constant and pervasive. She provided the stable, nurturing environment that allowed the household to function efficiently. Her quiet diligence and practical competence ensured that the family's basic needs were consistently met, providing a foundation of security and order. While Alfred engaged in public debate and civic duties, Beatrice managed the intricate details of daily life, lent a vital but often unsung contribution. Her personality was generally described as more reserved than Alfred's, her contributions less demonstrative. Yet, within the confines of the home, her presence was the bedrock upon which the family's life was built. Margaret would have witnessed firsthand the ceaseless effort involved in maintaining a comfortable and orderly home, the quiet strength required to manage the practicalities of existence. This observation of her mother's persistent underlying work would have subtly reinforced the value of diligent application and the importance of a well-ordered environment, contributing to the formation of Margaret's own disciplined approach to life. The practicalities of her mother's world, though domestic in scope, thus demonstrated a quiet resilience and an enduring commitment to the well-being of her family. Young Margaret's early childhood unfolded within a carefully structured environment, one where routine and responsibility were not merely encouraged, but were integral to daily life. Her days in the Grantham home above the grocery shop were marked by a predictable rhythm, a steady cadence that instilled a sense of order and purpose from a very tender age. There was little room for idleness or unstructured play, Instead, every hour seemed to carry with it an implicit expectation of engagement and contribution. From her earliest years, Margaret was gently inducted into the workings of the family enterprise and the maintenance of the home. This was not through harsh imposition, but through observation and gradual participation. She would have witnessed her father's meticulous attention to his business and civic duties, and her mother's tireless management of the household. These were silent lessons, absorbed through the everyday fabric of her existence. Simple chores, age-appropriate tasks, and an understanding of the value of collective effort were woven into her upbringing. The grocery shop itself served as a living classroom. Margaret would have spent time observing the transactions, the careful handling of goods, and the interactions with customers. She learned about the practicalities of commerce, the importance of accuracy, and the value of honest dealing. These were not abstract concepts, but tangible realities unfolding before her eyes. The scent of various provisions, the sound of the till, and the quiet hum of daily trade formed part of the sensory landscape of her youth. Within the family home, expectations of decorum and diligence were consistently maintained. Conversations at the dinner table often revolved around current events, moral principles, and the importance of self-improvement. There was an emphasis on intellectual curiosity and the pursuit of knowledge, encouraged by her father's own voracious reading and thoughtful discussions. Margaret was taught to articulate her thoughts clearly, to engage with ideas, and to understand the wider world through a lens of considered reflection. This structured upbringing, with its quiet lessons in responsibility and its steady routines, laid a deep foundation for the disciplined and purposeful individual she would become. Yet the structured environment of Margaret's home life naturally extended into her formal education. Her intellectual capabilities became increasingly apparent during her years at Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School, a selective grammar school that offered a rigorous academic curriculum. This institution, like many grammar schools of its era, represented a pathway for bright students from varied backgrounds to achieve academic excellence and social mobility. The atmosphere within its walls was one of serious study, where diligence and intellectual curiosity were highly valued and actively cultivated. Margaret thrived in this demanding setting. Her academic record was consistently strong, reflecting a disciplined approach to her studies and a keen aptitude for learning. While she demonstrated competence across a range of subjects, it was in the sciences that her particular talents began to emerge with notable clarity. Chemistry, in particular, captured her interest and allowed her to apply a methodical, analytical approach to problem-solving. This early affinity for scientific inquiry, with its emphasis on empirical evidence and logical deduction, would prove to be a significant thread in her intellectual development, shaping her way of thinking and her approach to challenges in later life. The educational environment of the 1930s and early 1940s in such schools was characterized by a focus on core subjects, clear instructional methods, and a strong emphasis on foundational knowledge. Resources might have been modest by modern standards, but the quality of teaching was often high, delivered by dedicated educators who believed in the transformative power of education. For Margaret, the school provided not only an academic grounding, but also an arena for developing her organisational skills and her capacity for sustained effort. It was here that her natural intelligence was honed and directed, preparing her for the competitive academic landscape that lay ahead, and subtly influencing the systematic approach she would later bring to complex national and international issues. While Margaret Roberts pursued her education within the structured confines of Grantham, the wider British landscape during the interwar years was characterised by a profound sense of transition and quiet unease. The immediate aftermath of the First World War left an indelible mark on the nation, not only in the tragic loss of a generation, but also in the deep economic dislocations that followed. Industries that had flourished during wartime, such as coal mining and shipbuilding, faced severe decline, leading to widespread unemployment and social hardship in many regions. The memory of the trenches and the immense sacrifice lingered heavily in the national consciousness, fostering a desire for peace and stability, yet also a recognition of the fragility of such aspirations. Amidst these economic challenges, new social ideas began to circulate, challenging long-held traditions and norms. The expansion of suffrage had given women a greater voice, and discussions around social welfare, public health, and the role of the state in supporting its citizens gained prominence. There was a growing awareness of poverty and inequality, prompting calls for reform and greater social provision. Figures like William Beveridge were beginning to formulate ideas that would later reshape the fabric of British society, even as their full impact remained years away. Beneath the surface of daily life, a quiet anxiety permeated the air. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure lasting peace, proved to be a fragile instrument. The rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, particularly the aggressive expansionism of Nazi Germany, cast an increasingly dark shadow over the continent. News from abroad, often carried by radio and newspapers into homes like the Roberts, spoke of escalating tensions and the growing threat of another global conflict. For many ordinary Britons, the period was marked by a longing for normalcy and security, yet simultaneously by an unspoken apprehension about the future, a recognition that the world was indeed in flux, with profound and unpredictable changes still to come. This backdrop of national introspection and looming external threat would, in its own way, shape the generation coming of age. Within the Roberts household, beyond the rhythms of the grocery shop and the quiet diligence of domestic life, the world of public affairs found a regular and resonant voice through Alfred Roberts. His deep engagement in local politics, serving on the Grantham Borough Council, and eventually as mayor, provided Margaret with a unique and early exposure to the mechanics of public discourse and decision-making. These were not abstract concepts learned from textbooks, but living, breathing conversations that unfolded within their home, around the dinner table and in the hushed, attentive atmosphere of council meetings. Margaret would often sit quietly, observing her father's preparations for debates, listening to his careful articulation of arguments, and witnessing his interactions with fellow councillors and constituents. She absorbed the cadence of local governance, the patient negotiation, the differing viewpoints, and the practical application of principles to everyday issues like town planning, rates, and public services. Her father's conservative philosophy, rooted in fiscal prudence, individual responsibility, and a belief in community self-reliance, was not explicitly taught, but rather demonstrated through his actions and expressed in his reasoned arguments. These were formative years for a young mind attuned to detail and logic, and Margaret observed how decisions, even seemingly small ones at a local level, could impact the lives of ordinary people. She saw the importance of clear communication, the need for conviction, and the quiet authority that came from a well-reasoned position. The local council chamber became an informal classroom where the lessons were not about grand national policy, but about the bedrock principles of governance and the practicalities of serving a community. She witnessed the dedication required, the sometimes frustrating pace of collective decision-making, and the quiet satisfaction of incremental progress. These early observations, made from a position of quiet attentiveness, allowed her to internalize the rhythms of public service. The debates her father engaged in, the principles he upheld, and the diligent work he undertook for Grantham all contributed to a foundational understanding of politics that transcended mere theory. It was an apprenticeship in the conservative outlook, grounded in the tangible needs of a specific place and its people, shaping her nascent understanding of how society was ordered and how it might be led. In the autumn of 1943, Margaret Roberts embarked upon a new chapter, arriving at Somerville College, Oxford, a venerable institution for women. Her chosen field of study was chemistry, a discipline that resonated with her precise intellect and methodical approach, honed during her years at Kesteven and Grantham Girls' School. The Oxford she entered was not one of pre-war tranquillity. The Second World War cast a long shadow over the ancient university city. Those male students were often called away to military service, and many colleges adapted to the austere realities of wartime, with curtailed resources and a pervasive sense of national effort. Despite these circumstances, the academic rigour of Oxford remained undiminished, demanding intense focus and intellectual discipline from its students. Within the laboratories and lecture halls of Somerville, Margaret immersed herself in the scientific method, delving into the intricacies of chemical reactions and theoretical principles. Her studies provided a structured framework for inquiry, emphasizing empirical evidence and logical deduction, skills that would prove invaluable in her later life. Yet, Oxford offered more than just scientific instruction. It was a crucible of ideas, a place where minds from diverse backgrounds converged, and where intellectual and political currents flowed freely, even amidst the global conflict. It was within this vibrant, albeit wartime-constrained environment that Margaret's political inclinations began to solidify and find expression. She joined the Oxford University Conservative Association, an organisation that provided a natural outlet for the principles instilled by her father. Here, she engaged in debates and discussions, articulating her views on contemporary issues and refining her oratorical skills. The association offered a platform to explore conservative ideology beyond the local sphere, connecting her to broader national and international political thought. Her involvement was not passive. She quickly became an active and prominent member, demonstrating a keen interest in the organisation's workings and its outreach. This period at Oxford, therefore, was not solely about the pursuit of scientific knowledge. It was also a crucial time for her political awakening, where the quiet observations of her youth in Grantham transformed into active participation in the intellectual and political life of a leading university, laying the groundwork for a future far removed from the laboratory bench. The Oxford Margaret Roberts experienced was deeply marked by the ongoing global conflict. The tranquil academic cloisters often associated with the university were juxtaposed with the harsh realities of wartime Britain. Daily life for students, much like for the wider population, was governed by the necessities of the war effort. Rationing was a constant presence, dictating the quantity and type of food available, fostering a collective understanding of scarcity and the prudent management of resources. This practical experience of doing more with less, of making careful choices under constraints, subtly reinforced the values of efficiency and self-reliance that had been part of her upbringing. Blackouts were another defining feature of the period. As dusk fell, the city of Oxford would plunge into darkness, a deliberate measure to deter enemy bombers. Windows were carefully covered, and streetlights remained unlit, transforming familiar pathways into shadowed landscapes. Navigating the college grounds or the streets of the city under these conditions required vigilance and adaptation. These enforced periods of darkness, while a sombre reminder of the war, also fostered a sense of shared purpose and a quiet determination to carry on amidst adversity. Beyond these tangible aspects, a profound sense of national purpose permeated the academic environment. While the pursuit of knowledge continued, it was often framed within the context of contributing to the war effort or preparing for the post-war world. Discussions in common rooms and college halls frequently turned to the progress of the war, the sacrifices being made, and the vision for a future peace. This collective dedication to a greater cause, the unity in facing a common threat, provided a powerful, if unspoken, education in resilience and collective responsibility. For Margaret, these experiences at wartime Oxford were not merely incidental background. They became an integral part of her formative years, shaping her understanding of national crisis, the importance of steadfastness, and the enduring spirit of the British people. The daily challenges of wartime living, the continuous demand for resourcefulness, and the pervasive atmosphere of national resolve contributed to the development of a quiet but profound resilience within her. This period, therefore, offered a different kind of education, one forged in the crucible of conflict, emphasizing fortitude and the practicalities of enduring hardship. As Margaret Roberts navigated the academic and social currents of Oxford, her developing political sensibilities began to find firmer intellectual grounding. While her father's practical conservatism had provided a foundational framework, the university environment offered exposure to broader philosophical currents and more systematic arguments. It was during this period that she encountered works that would profoundly influence her emerging worldview, shaping her understanding of liberty, economics, and the role of the state. Among these influential texts, Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, stood out with particular resonance. Hayek, an Austrian-born economist and philosopher, presented a powerful critique of central planning and socialism, arguing that government control over economic life inevitably leads to a loss of individual freedom and, ultimately, to totalitarianism. He posited that the path to prosperity and liberty lay in free markets and limited government intervention, allowing individuals to make their own choices within a framework of law. For Margaret Roberts, Hayek's arguments provided a sophisticated intellectual articulation of many of the intuitions she had gleaned from her upbringing. The emphasis on individual responsibility, the dangers of overreach by the state, and the virtue of economic freedom resonated deeply with her father's entrepreneurial spirit and his belief in self-reliance. Hayek offered a rigorous theoretical defense for the principles she had observed in practice within her own family's business and in her father's local governance. This engagement with Hayek was not a sudden conversion, but rather a quiet intellectual journey, a process of absorbing and integrating complex ideas. It provided a powerful counterpoint to the prevailing post-war consensus in Britain, which often leaned towards greater state intervention and the expansion of social welfare programs. Hayek's work offered a clear philosophical blueprint for a different path, one that prioritized individual liberty and market forces. The Road to Serfdom served as a significant intellectual pillar in the construction of her conservative philosophy, reinforcing her conviction in the merits of capitalism and the imperative of restraining state power. It equipped her with a robust intellectual framework to articulate her beliefs, moving beyond practical observations to a more comprehensive understanding of economic and political liberalism. This quiet intellectual immersion solidified her commitment to principles that would later define her political career. As the Second World War concluded, Britain entered a new, transformative era characterized by a profound shift in political and social philosophy. The collective experience of wartime sacrifice and national unity fostered a widespread belief in the necessity of a more egalitarian society and a greater role for the state in ensuring the welfare of its citizens. This period saw the emergence of a broad political consensus, transcending traditional party lines that would define British public life for decades. At the heart of this new consensus was the creation of the welfare state. The Beveridge Report of 1942 had laid the intellectual foundations for a comprehensive system of social security, envisioning a nation free from the five giants of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. The post-war Labour government under Clement Attlee moved swiftly to implement these recommendations. The National Health Service was established in 1948, providing universal healthcare free at the point of use. Education was reformed, social housing programs expanded, and a comprehensive system of national insurance put in place. These reforms were not merely the agenda of one political party. They represented a widely accepted vision for the future of Britain. Even the Conservative Party, after its return to power in the 1950s, largely embraced the core tenets of the welfare state. Key industries such as coal, railways and steel were nationalised, managed by the state for the perceived benefit of the nation. Full employment became a primary policy objective, often achieved through demand management and government spending. This era was marked by a spirit of collectivism and a strong belief in the capacity of government to address social and economic challenges. The idea that the state had a responsibility to protect citizens from cradle to grave became deeply ingrained in the national consciousness. Economic policy often prioritised stability and social cohesion over radical market reforms. Trade unions wielded considerable influence, playing a significant role in industrial relations and wage negotiations. For a young Margaret Roberts, whose intellectual leanings had been drawn towards Hayek's critiques of state intervention, this prevailing consensus represented a formidable challenge. It was a political landscape fundamentally different from the one her father had navigated in local politics, and one that directly contrasted with her developing convictions about individual liberty and limited government. The post-war settlement, with its emphasis on collective provision and state control, set the stage for the profound ideological battles that would later define her political career. Following her time at Oxford and the initial years of her career as a research chemist, Margaret Roberts felt an undeniable pull towards public service, a calling nurtured since her childhood in Grantham. Her conservative convictions, sharpened by her academic studies and the intellectual ferment of the post-war period, sought an outlet in the arena of national politics. It was in this context that she made the significant decision to seek a parliamentary seat, a challenging ambition for any young person, and particularly so for a woman in the political landscape of the late 1940s. In 1949, at the age of 24, Margaret Roberts was adopted as the Conservative candidate for the constituency of Dartford. This was a notable achievement in itself, as the selection committees of the time were largely male-dominated, and often hesitant to put forward female candidates, especially in seats considered unwinnable. Dartford was indeed a formidable challenge. It was a deeply entrenched Labour stronghold in Kent, a working-class industrial town where the post-war Labour government's policies resonated strongly. The incumbent Labour MP held a substantial majority, making any prospect of victory exceedingly remote. Her campaigns in both the 1950 and 1951 general elections were characterised by relentless energy and a methodical approach, just traits that would become hallmarks of her political style. As a young woman campaigning in a predominantly male political world, she faced both curiosity and scepticism. Her youth and gender were often remarked upon, sometimes with condescension. Yet, she approached the task with unwavering determination, engaging directly with voters, attending countless meetings, and speaking at every available opportunity. She traversed the constituency, from factories to housing estates, articulating her conservative principles with clarity and conviction. Her speeches focused on individual liberty, economic efficiency, and the responsible management of public funds, often subtly contrasting these ideas with the prevailing collectivist sentiment of the era. She possessed a remarkable ability to distill complex economic concepts into understandable terms, a skill honed during her Oxford debates. Despite the insurmountable odds in Dartford, her campaigning efforts brought her significant public attention. She became the youngest female candidate in the 1950 election, a fact that garnered national press coverage and introduced her to a wider audience. Though she was unsuccessful in both attempts, reducing the Labour majority in a challenging seat was considered a commendable performance. These early electoral contests were invaluable learning experiences, providing her with first-hand knowledge of grassroots politics, the demands of public speaking, and the resilience required to navigate the often bruising world of electoral campaigning. They also solidified her resolve to pursue a career in the House of Commons, despite the immediate setbacks. Amidst the demanding rhythm of her early political endeavours, a significant personal development unfolded for Margaret Roberts. In December of 1951, she married Denis Thatcher, a successful businessman whom she had met through Conservative Party circles. This union marked a new chapter in her life, providing a stable and supportive personal foundation upon which her ambitious public career would continue to build. Denis Thatcher was a man of considerable experience and a distinct character. Born in 1915, he was 10 years her senior, a veteran of World War II, having served with distinction in the Royal Artillery. After the war, he returned to the family paint and chemical business, Atlas Preservative Company, where he demonstrated considerable acumen. His background was one of quiet accomplishment and practical common sense, a grounding influence that contrasted in certain ways with Margaret's more overtly intellectual and politically driven disposition. From the outset, Denis adopted a role of unwavering yet discreet support for his wife's aspirations. He understood and respected her political ambition, never seeking to overshadow or compete with her public life. Instead, he provided a steady presence, managing the practicalities of their shared existence and offering encouragement without intrusion. His financial success also provided a degree of independence and security, allowing Margaret to pursue her studies in law and continue her political campaigning without immediate financial pressures. Their life together quickly adapted to the demands of Margaret's evolving career. In 1953, their family expanded with the birth of twins Carol and Mark. This event introduced the complexities of balancing motherhood with professional and political ambitions, a challenge faced by many women of her generation, though perhaps amplified by Margaret's unique trajectory. Denis's calm demeanour and practical approach were undoubtedly valuable in navigating these new responsibilities, creating an environment where Margaret could continue to pursue her goals. His supportive partnership became a constant, largely unseen element of her public journey, a quiet anchor in the often turbulent waters of political life. Following her marriage and the birth of her twins Carol and Mark in 1953, Margaret Thatcher embarked upon another significant intellectual pursuit, studying for the bar. This decision reflected not only her deep-seated drive for intellectual challenge, but also a pragmatic recognition of the need for a professional qualification that offered both intellectual rigour and a degree of flexibility. Given the demands of young motherhood and her continued political ambitions, a career at the bar, with its potential for independent practice, presented a compelling path. The years that followed were characterised by a period of intense, quiet determination. Balancing the care of infant twins with the rigorous demands of legal study required exceptional discipline and an almost relentless work ethic. Margaret approached her legal texts with the same methodical precision she applied to all her intellectual endeavours. Late nights were often spent immersed in statutes, case law and legal principles, while her days were structured around the routines of family life. This period truly exemplified her capacity for sustained effort and her ability to compartmentalise and prioritise tasks, a skill that would serve her throughout her life. Her studies culminated in her call to the bar in 1954, a notable achievement for any individual, but particularly so for a young mother in that era. She specialised in tax law, an area that appealed to her analytical mind and her interest in the practicalities of finance and state administration. This specialization would later provide her with a deep understanding of economic mechanisms and public finance, knowledge that would prove invaluable in her subsequent political career. This phase of her life, though less public than her earlier political campaigns, was crucial for her intellectual development. It was a time of internal consolidation, where she sharpened her analytical skills, deepened her understanding of legal frameworks, and further cultivated her capacity for logical argument and precise expression. The discipline required to master complex legal concepts, while simultaneously managing the responsibilities of a young family, underscored her formidable mental fortitude. It was a period of quiet growth, laying down further layers of intellectual strength and personal resilience, preparing her for the more prominent roles that lay ahead. In 1954, Margaret Thatcher successfully achieved her call to the bar, formally qualifying as a barrister. This significant milestone marked the culmination of years of dedicated study, often undertaken amidst the demanding rhythms of early motherhood. Her perseverance through these challenging circumstances underscored her remarkable capacity for sustained intellectual effort and her unwavering commitment to her chosen path. The Inns of Court, with their ancient traditions and rigorous academic standards, provided a formidable training ground, shaping a precise and disciplined legal mind. Upon qualification, she began to practice as a barrister, focusing particularly on tax law. This specialization was not arbitrary. It reflected her innate preference for structured analysis and her interest in the intricate workings of economic policy and individual responsibility. Tax law, by its very nature, demands meticulous attention to detail, an ability to interpret complex statutes, and a clear understanding of the financial implications of legal decisions. It required a capacity to dissect intricate financial arrangements and to argue positions based on precise legal interpretation. Her daily work involved advising clients on various aspects of taxation, navigating the complexities of the British fiscal system. This practical engagement with legal frameworks provided a tangible understanding of how governmental policies directly impacted individuals and businesses. It was an education not just in legal procedure, but in the practical application of economic principles and the nuances of state regulation. This experience offered a grounded perspective on the burdens and benefits of taxation, fostering an appreciation for efficiency and clarity in financial legislation. The discipline of legal practice, especially in a specialized field like tax law, undoubtedly refined her analytical approach. It instilled a habit of rigorous evidence-based reasoning, an insistence on clarity of argument, and a methodical approach to problem-solving. These were qualities that would become hallmarks of her political career. Her time at the bar provided a robust intellectual foundation, equipping her with sharp argumentative skills and a deep practical understanding of the economic realities that underpinned much of public policy. It was a period of quiet yet profound preparation for the more public battles that lay ahead. Even after her experiences in Dartford and the establishment of her legal career, Margaret Thatcher's political aspirations remained steadfast. The desire to serve in Parliament, to directly influence the course of the nation, continued to be a powerful underlying current in her life. The path to securing a safe parliamentary seat, however, was often long and arduous, particularly for a woman in the political landscape of the 1950s. It required not only a clear articulation of political principles, but also a sustained effort in navigating the intricate selection processes of the Conservative Party. She diligently sought out opportunities, applying for consideration in various constituencies across the country. Each application involved submitting detailed personal statements, attending interviews with local party associations, and often delivering speeches to selection committees. This was a process of constant evaluation, where candidates were scrutinised not only for their political acumen, but also for their perceived electability and their alignment with local party values. Many promising individuals would apply for numerous seats before finding a suitable opportunity, and rejection was a common part of the journey. Her quiet persistence, a quality noted by those around her, was evident during these years. She did not allow initial setbacks to deter her. Instead, she continued to refine her political message, drawing upon her legal knowledge and her growing understanding of public affairs. Her commitment to conservative ideals, rooted in individual liberty and economic prudence, became increasingly defined. Finally, in 1958, her sustained efforts bore fruit when she was selected as the prospective Conservative candidate for Finchley, a constituency in North London. This was a significant step forward. Finchley was considered a relatively safe Conservative seat, offering a realistic prospect of entry into the House of Commons. The selection process in Finchley, like others, involved a careful vetting by the local party, but her articulate presentation and evident dedication ultimately won their support. This selection positioned her on the cusp of realising her long-held ambition to sit in Parliament. With her selection as the prospective candidate for Finchley, the path to Westminster became clear. The general election of 1959 arrived, and Margaret Thatcher campaigned with the characteristic diligence and methodical approach that had defined her earlier political endeavours. The outcome in Finchley was a decisive victory, and she formally entered the House of Commons as a Member of Parliament. This moment marked a profound shift, transforming her from an aspiring candidate into an active participant in the nation's legislative body. The House of Commons she entered was a place steeped in tradition, its rituals and procedures having evolved over centuries. Debates unfolded within its hallowed walls, often marked by a particular style of parliamentary discourse that blended formal address with robust argument. It was a predominantly male environment, reflecting the societal norms of the era. While women had gained the right to sit in Parliament earlier in the century, their numbers remained comparatively small. In 1959, the cohort of female MPs was still a distinct minority, making Margaret Thatcher part of a pioneering group, while quietly challenging established conventions merely by their presence and participation. Her initial contributions to parliamentary life were characterised by a focus on legal and financial matters, drawing directly from her professional background as a tax barrister. Her maiden speech, delivered in February 1960, concerned a private member's bill she introduced, advocating for the Public Bodies, Admission to Meetings, Act. This seemingly technical piece of legislation aimed to compel local authorities to open their meetings to the press and public, promoting greater transparency in local governance. It was a practical and principled initiative, reflecting her belief in accountability and open administration. From the outset, she demonstrated a keen ability to grasp complex details and to articulate her arguments with clarity and precision. She observed the workings of Parliament, learning its intricacies and understanding the unspoken rules that governed its operations. She listened to debates, studied the legislative process, and began to forge connections with fellow members. Her early years in the House were a period of quiet assimilation and diligent application, laying the groundwork for the more prominent roles she would eventually undertake. She was a new voice, certainly, but one that was carefully finding its register within the grand chorus of Westminster. Upon entering the House of Commons, Margaret Thatcher took her place among the backbenchers, a position from which newly elected members typically begin their parliamentary service. This period, stretching through the early 1960s, was characterised by diligent work rather than immediate prominence. She did not seek to immediately dominate debates or capture headlines, but instead focused on understanding the mechanisms of government and making practical contributions. Her work during these initial years often revolved around issues of local government and financial administration, areas where her legal background proved particularly valuable. One notable example of her backbench activity was her persistent advocacy for the Public Bodies Admission to Meetings Act. This private member's bill, which she introduced and championed, aimed to ensure that local council meetings were open to the public and the press. It was a reform designed to enhance transparency and accountability at the local level, of reflecting a core belief in good governance. Guiding such a bill through Parliament required considerable effort, negotiation, and a deep understanding of parliamentary procedure. Her success in seeing this legislation enacted demonstrated not only her commitment to the principle of open government, but also her effectiveness as a legislator, even from the backbenches. Beyond specific legislative initiatives, Margaret Thatcher dedicated herself to the broader duties of an MP. She immersed herself in constituency matters, addressing the concerns of her constituents in Finchley. She attended parliamentary committee meetings, where much of the detailed work of scrutinising legislation and policy took place. Her contributions were often precise and well-researched, reflecting her methodical approach to any task. During this time, she observed the political landscape, the shifting alliances, and the personalities within the Conservative Party and across the parliamentary divide. She honed her debating skills, learning to present her arguments concisely and persuasively. It was a period of quiet but significant development, as she steadily built a reputation for diligence, intellect, and a principled approach to public service. Her time on the backbenches was not a passive wait, but an active apprenticeship in the art of parliamentary politics. Margaret Thatcher's diligent work on the backbenches, marked by her meticulous attention to detail and her successful private member's bill, did not go unnoticed. Her capacity for hard work and her clear grasp of policy matters began to distinguish her within the Conservative Party. This steady application of her abilities paved the way for her first governmental appointment. In 1961, just 2 years after entering Parliament, she was elevated from the backbenches to a junior ministerial position. She became the Parliamentary Secretary for Pensions and National Insurance in Harold Macmillan's government. This appointment represented a significant step forward in her political journey, moving her from the role of an independent legislator to a participant in the executive branch. As Parliamentary Secretary, she was tasked with supporting the senior minister in the department, assisting in the formulation and implementation of government policy relating to social security. This role provided her with invaluable direct experience in the machinery of government. She was exposed to the complexities of administering a vast public service, learning about the intricate workings of the civil service and the practical challenges of delivering welfare provisions to millions of citizens. The learning curve in such a position was steep. It required mastering a new set of skills, including understanding the budgetary implications of departmental decisions, engaging with civil servants, and representing the government's position both within Parliament and to the wider public. She had to become adept at navigating the departmental brief, understanding the nuances of policy proposals, and defending them against scrutiny from the opposition. This period allowed her to acquire crucial administrative experience. She observed firsthand how policies were translated from ideas into tangible programs, how departments were structured, and how decisions were made within the hierarchy of government. It also gave her a deeper appreciation for the scale and scope of state intervention in the lives of ordinary people. While her later political philosophy would often advocate for reduced state involvement, this early experience provided her with an intimate understanding of the system she would later seek to reform. Her time as a junior minister was a foundational experience, broadening her understanding of governance far beyond the confines of legal argument or backbench advocacy. The Conservative Party's defeat in the 1964 general election brought an end to 13 years of continuous Tory government. For Margaret Thatcher, this meant a transition from the junior ranks of government to the opposition benches. This period, which spanned 6 years under the leadership of Edward Heath, proved to be another formative phase in her political development. In opposition, her role shifted from implementing policy to scrutinising the government's actions. She was appointed to various shadow ministerial roles, beginning with land and housing, and later moving to Treasury matters and transport. These positions placed her directly in front of government ministers, challenging their legislative proposals and holding them accountable for their decisions. This time allowed her to hone her analytical approach to policy. Rather than merely accepting government pronouncements, she delved deeply into the details, seeking out weaknesses, inconsistencies, and potential flaws. Her background as a barrister, accustomed to dissecting arguments and presenting a coherent case, served her well in this capacity. She brought a disciplined, methodical rigour to her critiques, often focusing on the economic implications and practical consequences of the Labour government's policies. She learned to articulate dissent with precision, identifying areas where she believed the government was overspending, over-regulating, or failing to deliver on its promises. This was not a period for broad ideological pronouncements, but rather for the detailed forensic examination of specific bills and departmental policies. She studied white papers, interrogated statistics, and sought expert opinions, building up a comprehensive understanding of the policy areas she shadowed. Her contributions in opposition were characterised by a persistent and often unyielding questioning of the prevailing consensus. She was not afraid to challenge popular ideas, particularly those related to state intervention and public expenditure. This period strengthened her resolve and sharpened her rhetorical skills, preparing her for more prominent roles. It was a time of intellectual growth, where she refined her ability to dismantle arguments and articulate alternative approaches, all while observing the dynamics of parliamentary debate from a different vantage point. As the Conservative Party continued its time in opposition, a significant milestone for Margaret Thatcher arrived in 1967, when she was appointed to the Shadow Cabinet by Edward Heath. Her portfolio was Shadow Secretary of State for Education and Science. This appointment marked her elevation to the front rank of the party, placing her in a position of greater influence and visibility within the parliamentary hierarchy. The role of Shadow Education Secretary was a substantial one, encompassing a wide array of policy areas, from primary schooling to university funding, and from curriculum development to scientific research. It required a deep engagement with complex issues and a capacity to articulate a coherent conservative vision for education in Britain. One of the most prominent policy debates during this era concerned comprehensive education. The Labour government of the time was strongly committed to replacing the tripartite system of grammar, secondary modern, and technical schools with a comprehensive model which aimed to educate all children in a single type of school regardless of academic ability. This was a highly contentious issue, thus deeply dividing public and political opinion. Margaret Thatcher, while acknowledging the desire for equality of opportunity, expressed reservations about the wholesale abolition of grammar schools. She argued for parental choice and for maintaining standards of excellence, believing that grammar schools offered a vital pathway for academically gifted children from all backgrounds. Her approach was not one of outright opposition to comprehensive education in all forms, but rather a nuanced argument for preserving diversity and choice within the educational landscape. Beyond the comprehensive debate, she also engaged with issues of teacher training, school funding, and the role of science and technology in national development. The challenges of the role were considerable, and demanding not only a grasp of policy specifics, but also the political skill to navigate deeply held beliefs and passionate advocacy from various stakeholders, including teachers' unions, parent groups, and local authorities. This period in the Shadow Cabinet provided her with invaluable experience in shaping and presenting policy from a senior leadership position, further preparing her for the responsibilities that lay ahead. Upon the Conservative victory in the 1970 general election, Margaret Thatcher was appointed Secretary of State for Education and Science in Edward Heath's government. This elevation to a full cabinet position brought with it the direct responsibility for implementing government policy and managing a significant public department. It was in this role that she would make a decision that, while seemingly minor in the grand scheme of national finances, would generate a disproportionately strong public reaction and attach a memorable, though unwelcome, label to her name. One of the government's objectives was to reduce public spending, and various departments were tasked with identifying areas for economies. Within the Department for Education and Science, the provision of free school milk for primary school children was identified as a potential saving. This policy, which had been in place for decades, offered a small carton of milk each day to children under the age of 11. The cost, while not enormous in isolation, contributed to the broader departmental budget. The decision was made to end the universal provision of free milk for primary school children over the age of 7. This was not a policy conceived by Thatcher alone. It was part of a wider government drive to cut expenditure. However, as the minister responsible for the department, she became the public face of the decision. The announcement of this change sparked immediate and widespread public outcry. For many, free school milk was seen as a fundamental benefit, a small but tangible sign of the welfare state's care for children's health. Critics argued that removing it would harm children's nutrition, particularly those from less affluent backgrounds. The media seized upon the story, and the phrase "milk snatcher" quickly entered the public lexicon, becoming a persistent and often derogatory label associated with Margaret Thatcher. Demonstrations were held and public figures voiced their strong disapproval. The intensity of the reaction was perhaps unexpected for a measure that, in purely financial terms, was relatively modest. Through this storm of criticism, Margaret Thatcher maintained a quiet resolve. She defended the decision as a necessary measure to control public spending and reallocate resources where they were deemed more critical. She believed that the savings could be better used to improve other aspects of education, such as school buildings or teaching resources. This episode, though painful at the time, offered an early glimpse into her capacity to withstand intense public pressure and hold firm to decisions she believed were correct, even in the face of widespread unpopularity. It foreshadowed a characteristic that would become a defining feature of her political career. The government led by Edward Heath, which came to power in 1970, inherited a complex and challenging economic landscape. Heath himself was a dedicated pro-European and a committed moderniser who sought to reform Britain's economy and its industrial relations. His initial approach, often referred to as Selsdon Man policies, aimed for a more free market approach, reducing state intervention and curbing the power of trade unions. This philosophy resonated with some elements within the Conservative Party, including Margaret Thatcher, who had long advocated for less state control. However, the period of 1970 to 1974 was marked by significant economic turbulence. Global oil price shocks, lingering inflation, and persistent industrial disputes created an increasingly difficult environment for Heath's administration. The government found itself grappling with widespread strikes, this particularly within key industries such as coal mining. These disputes were not merely about wages, they represented a fundamental struggle over power between the government and the well-organised and influential trade unions. Heath's attempts to introduce industrial relations legislation aimed at moderating union power and preventing disruptive strikes met with fierce resistance. The miners' strikes of 1972 and 1974 in particular crippled the nation's energy supply, leading to significant disruption, including the imposition of a 3-day working week to conserve electricity. These events underscored the deep divisions within British society and the potent force of organised labour. The government's initial free market stance gradually shifted as it faced these mounting pressures. Attempts to control inflation through statutory incomes policies, a departure from the original Selsdon principles, were ultimately unsuccessful in stemming the tide of economic unrest. This period of increasing instability and policy adjustments began to foster a sense of disillusionment among some within the Conservative Party. There was a growing feeling that the government had not been sufficiently robust in its dealings with the unions and that its economic policies lacked a consistent, unwavering direction. This internal dissatisfaction, though not yet overtly challenging Heath's leadership, was a quiet undercurrent, gradually building as the government struggled to navigate the turbulent waters of the early 1970s. The mid-1970s saw Britain grappling with a profound sense of economic and social instability. Following the turbulent years of the Heath government and the 2 general elections of 1974, the Labour Party, under Harold Wilson and later James Callaghan, took the reins. However, the underlying issues of inflation, high unemployment, and recurrent industrial unrest persisted, casting a long shadow over the nation's prospects. The social contract, an attempt by the Labour government to control wages and prices through agreement with trade unions, gradually unravelled. This period of simmering discontent reached its zenith in late 1978 and early 1979, an era that would become famously known as the Winter of Discontent. Across the country, vital public services ground to a halt as waves of strikes swept through various sectors. Lorry drivers, railway workers, dustmen, hospital ancillary staff, and even gravediggers participated in industrial action, each seeking improved pay and conditions in the face of persistent inflation. The daily lives of ordinary citizens were profoundly disrupted. Rubbish accumulated in the streets, hospital waiting lists grew longer, and the movement of goods became severely constrained. The sight of uncollected refuse and the news reports of closed public facilities conveyed a powerful image of a nation struggling to maintain its basic functions. This widespread disruption was not merely an inconvenience, it fostered a deep-seated feeling of national crisis and a perception of a country on the brink. The Winter of Discontent exposed the perceived weakness of the government in its ability to manage the powerful trade unions and control the economy. There was a growing public sentiment that the traditional approaches to governance were failing and that a stronger, more decisive form of leadership was required. The prevailing mood was one of exasperation and a yearning for stability and order. Many began to question the efficacy of a system where industrial action could so effectively paralyse the nation. This collective experience of profound disruption and perceived governmental impotence created fertile ground for a new political narrative, one that promised a radical departure from the status quo and a restoration of firm authority. The seeds of significant political change were quietly being sown within this period of widespread national unease. The Conservative Party, having lost 2 general elections in 1974, found itself in a period of introspection and disarray. Edward Heath, the incumbent leader, faced increasing criticism from within his own ranks. His leadership, perceived by some as indecisive and out of touch with the evolving political landscape, was seen as a barrier to the party's return to power. While many recognised the need for change, the idea of a challenge to Heath's authority was initially met with a degree of hesitation. It was in this atmosphere that Margaret Thatcher quietly began to consider her position. Though she had served in Heath's cabinet, her ideological leanings often diverged from his more pragmatic, consensus-driven approach. The Conservative Party's electoral defeats, coupled with the ongoing economic struggles, reinforced her belief that a bolder, more principled leadership was required. The decision to challenge Heath, however, was not one taken lightly. It represented a significant gamble, as unseating an established leader, particularly a former Prime Minister, was a rare and often risky undertaking in British politics. When her intention to stand for the leadership was announced in late 1974, it came as a surprise to many within Westminster. Few had anticipated that a relatively junior figure, and a woman at that, would dare to directly confront the party's long-standing leader. Her campaign was not one of bombastic pronouncements, but rather a methodical and quiet operation. She meticulously built a network of support, engaging in numerous private conversations with backbench members of Parliament, carefully articulating her vision for the party and the nation. Her supporters, a blend of traditional conservatives and emerging free market thinkers, and saw in her a conviction and clarity that they felt was absent from the party's current direction. They were drawn to her unwavering belief in individual liberty, fiscal prudence, and a strong national defence. The campaign was characterised by a quiet determination, focusing on policy and principle rather than personality. For some, observing the meticulous groundwork being laid and the growing disaffection with the existing leadership, there began to emerge a subtle sense of inevitability. The political tides were shifting, and Margaret Thatcher was positioning herself to ride that wave. The result of the Conservative Party leadership election, held in February 1975, sent a ripple through the established political order. In the first ballot, Margaret Thatcher secured more votes than Edward Heath, a clear indication of the desire for change within the party. Heath, recognising the shift in sentiment, subsequently withdrew from the contest. In the second ballot, Thatcher decisively defeated her remaining rivals, securing the leadership of the Conservative Party. With this victory, Margaret Thatcher quietly made history. She became the first woman to lead a major political party in the United Kingdom. This was a moment of profound significance, transcending the immediate political implications. For centuries, the highest echelons of British politics had been exclusively occupied by men. Her ascent challenged deeply ingrained societal norms and perceptions about leadership, competence, and gender roles. It was a quiet revolution in itself, a testament to her tenacity in the evolving landscape of public life. The immediate reactions to her victory were varied. Within the Conservative Party there was a mixture of relief, surprise, and for some, a degree of apprehension. Many welcomed the prospect of new leadership and a clearer ideological direction. Others, particularly those from the more centrist wing of the party, viewed her rise with a cautious scepticism, unsure of how her more assertive brand of conservatism would reshape the party's identity. Beyond the party, the broader political establishment and the media grappled with this unprecedented development. Commentators analysed the implications of a woman holding such a powerful position, often focusing on her personality and style as much as her policy positions. There was an undeniable fascination with this new figure on the national stage. Certes, a woman who had defied expectations and broken through significant barriers. Her elevation to leader of the opposition marked a quiet but fundamental shift in British political dynamics. The Labour government, led by Harold Wilson and later James Callaghan, now faced a formidable opponent with a clear and distinct vision. The era of consensus politics, which had largely defined the post-war period, began to recede, making way for a more confrontational and ideologically driven political discourse. Margaret Thatcher, now at the helm of a revitalised Conservative Party, was poised to define the terms of this new political engagement. As leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher embarked upon a deliberate process of articulating a distinct conservative philosophy, or one that contrasted sharply with the prevailing political consensus of the post-war era. Her time in this role, from 1975 to 1979, was dedicated to refining and presenting a coherent ideological framework that would become known as Thatcherism. At its core, this new conservatism placed a profound emphasis on individual liberty. Thatcher argued that individuals, rather than the state, were the primary agents of economic and social progress. She believed that excessive state intervention stifled initiative, eroded personal responsibility, and ultimately diminished the freedom of citizens to make their own choices and pursue their own ambitions. This perspective was a direct challenge to the collectivist tendencies that had influenced British politics for decades. On hand in hand with individual liberty was a steadfast belief in free markets. Thatcher contended that an economy allowed to operate with minimal governmental interference would be more dynamic, efficient, and prosperous. She advocated for deregulation, privatisation of state-owned industries, and a reduction in the power of trade unions, which she saw as impediments to economic growth and flexibility. Her arguments posited that competition and individual enterprise were the most effective engines for creating wealth and opportunity for all. Paradoxically, alongside this emphasis on a smaller state in economic affairs, she also championed the concept of a strong state in other areas. This strength was not to be expressed through economic control, but through the maintenance of law and order, a robust national defence, and the upholding of national sovereignty. She believed that a strong, disciplined state was necessary to provide a stable framework within which individual liberty and free markets could flourish. This was a state that would protect its citizens and its interests, but not dictate their economic lives. This articulation of a new conservatism was not merely a set of policy proposals. It was a clear ideological stance, a comprehensive vision for reforming Britain. It represented a decisive break from the paternalistic conservatism of her predecessor Edward Heath, and a direct challenge to the socialist principles espoused by the Labour Party. Thatcher spent these years patiently yet assertively building the intellectual foundations for the transformative policies she would later seek to implement, preparing the ground for a profound shift in the nation's direction. The stage for the 1979 general election was set against a backdrop of public dissatisfaction and a palpable desire for change. The preceding winter of discontent had left a deep impression on the national psyche, highlighting a sense of drift and a perceived inability of the incumbent Labour government to manage the nation's affairs effectively. When Prime Minister James Callaghan's government lost a vote of no confidence in March 1979, an election became inevitable, and Margaret Thatcher, as leader of the opposition, was ready. The Conservative campaign was disciplined and strategically focused, skillfully leveraging the public mood. A key element of this campaign was a series of iconic advertising posters, the most memorable of which depicted a long, winding queue of people ostensibly waiting for employment. Superimposed over this image was the stark, unambiguous slogan, "Labour isn't working." This potent visual and verbal message encapsulated the public's frustrations and presented a clear indictment of the government's economic record. It was simple, direct, and resonated widely. Thatcher herself campaigned vigorously, projecting an image of strength, resolve, and conviction. She travelled extensively, addressing rallies and meeting with ordinary citizens, articulating her vision for a revitalised Britain based on individual responsibility and free markets. While her public persona was firm, the campaign carefully balanced this with efforts to present her as a relatable figure, capable of understanding the everyday concerns of the populace. The public mood throughout the election period was one of quiet anticipation. There was a sense that the country was at a crossroads and that a significant shift in direction was likely. The economic turmoil and industrial unrest of the preceding years had created a widespread longing for stability and a new approach to governance. On May 3, 1979, the British people went to the polls. The results confirmed the widespread desire for change. The Conservative Party secured a decisive victory, winning a substantial majority of seats in the House of Commons. This triumph elevated Margaret Thatcher to the office of Prime Minister, making her the first woman to hold that position in British history. Her victory marked not merely a change of government, but the beginning of a new political era, and shaped by the distinct conservative philosophy she had painstakingly forged during her years in opposition. On the morning of May 4th, 1979, following her party's decisive electoral victory, Margaret Thatcher arrived at Buckingham Palace to be formally invited by Queen Elizabeth II to form a government. This customary ritual completed, she then proceeded directly to 10 Downing Street, the historic residence and office of the British Prime Minister. The moment of her arrival was imbued with a quiet yet profound symbolism. As she stepped out of the car, a woman in a role previously held exclusively by men, a new chapter in British political history began to unfold. The scene outside Downing Street was a blend of anticipation and historical gravitas. A crowd had gathered, along with numerous journalists and photographers, all eager to witness this unprecedented event. The black door of number 10, a familiar emblem of British governance, stood ready to welcome its new occupant. Margaret Thatcher, accompanied by her husband Dennis, paused briefly before entering, her composure reflecting the weight of the moment. Before stepping inside, she delivered her first address to the nation as Prime Minister. Her words, spoken with a calm and measured tone, were carefully chosen to convey both humility and a clear sense of purpose. She began by quoting the prayer of St. Francis of Assisi, stating, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope." This invocation, delivered at the outset of her premiership, set a particular tone, suggesting a desire for national unity and spiritual guidance amidst the challenges ahead. She then transitioned to outlining her government's immediate priorities, which included tackling inflation and restoring economic stability. Her address was brief, yet firm, signalling a commitment to a resolute approach to the nation's problems. There was no grandstanding, no overt triumphalism, but rather a quiet assertion of the serious work that lay before her administration. The image of Margaret Thatcher, a woman of middle-class origins standing on the doorstep of 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister, resonated deeply across the country, and indeed around the world. It was a tangible manifestation of her perseverance and a testament to the evolving social and political landscape. This historic moment marked the culmination of decades of striving and the commencement of a period of significant transformation for Britain, under a leader prepared to challenge established norms with unwavering conviction. Upon assuming office in May 1979, Margaret Thatcher's government swiftly began to implement a new economic philosophy, marking a clear departure from the post-war consensus. The central pillar of this approach was monetarism, a theory that posited a direct relationship between the amount of money circulating in an economy and the rate of inflation. In essence, monetarists believed that controlling the money supply was the most effective way to curb rising prices. For many years prior, British governments had grappled with persistent inflation, which eroded savings and created economic instability. Thatcher and her Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Geoffrey Howe, were convinced that excessive government spending and an uncontrolled expansion of the money supply were the root causes. Their strategy, therefore, involved a disciplined reduction in public expenditure and a strict control over the growth of the money supply through higher interest rates. The aim was to squeeze inflation out of the system, even if it meant a period of economic contraction and increased unemployment in the short term. This was a deliberate and often painful process, but one which they believed was necessary for long-term economic health. Alongside monetarism, the Thatcher government also championed supply-side reforms. This aspect of their economic philosophy focused on improving the underlying efficiency and competitiveness of the British economy. The idea was to create conditions that would encourage businesses to produce more goods and services, thereby increasing the overall supply in the economy. These reforms included measures designed to reduce the power of trade unions, which were seen as hindering productivity and flexibility in the labour market. There was also a strong emphasis on deregulation, removing what were perceived as unnecessary government obstacles to business activity. Tax cuts, particularly for higher earners and corporations, were also introduced with the belief that they would incentivise investment and entrepreneurship. The logic here was that by allowing individuals and businesses to retain more of their earnings, they would be more inclined to invest, innovate, and expand, ultimately leading to job creation and economic growth. The combination of monetarism to control inflation and supply-side reforms to boost productivity represented a fundamental shift in economic management. It was a bold and, for many, a radical departure from the interventionist policies that had characterized much of the preceding decades. The initial years of this approach would prove challenging, but they laid the groundwork for a sustained period of economic change and debate within Britain. The implementation of Margaret Thatcher's economic policies inevitably brought her government into direct confrontation with the powerful trade unions, whose influence had grown significantly in the preceding decades. The winter of discontent in 1978-79 had vividly demonstrated the union's capacity to disrupt essential services and exert considerable pressure on the state. For Thatcher, curbing this power was not merely an economic objective, but a necessary step to restore what she perceived as balance and order to the nation. One of the earliest and most significant skirmishes occurred in the steel industry. British Steel, a nationalised industry, was facing considerable financial difficulties and was deemed inefficient and overmanned. In late 1979, the government, through British Steel Management, proposed a substantial programme of job cuts and plant closures as part of its rationalisation efforts. This move was met with fierce resistance from the Steelworkers Union, the Iron and Steel Trades Confederation (ISTC), and other unions within the industry. In January 1980, a national strike by steelworkers began, lasting for 13 weeks. It was the longest national strike in the steel industry's history. The government's resolve was quietly but firmly evident throughout this period. They refused to intervene directly in the negotiations, insisting that it was a matter for British Steel Management. This stance was a deliberate signal that the state would no longer readily concede to union demands, nor would it bail out loss-making industries indefinitely. The strike caused significant disruption to the steel supply chain, impacting other industries. However, the government remained steadfast, unwilling to compromise on its principles of economic restructuring and reduce state intervention. The determination to hold the line, even in the face of considerable industrial action, underscored a new approach to industrial relations. It was a clear demonstration that the era of widespread concessions to union power was drawing to a close. The steel strike ultimately ended with the unions accepting many of the job cuts and a significantly lower pay increase than initially sought, marking a quiet but meaningful victory for the government and setting a precedent for future confrontations. In April of 1982, an unexpected and profound challenge emerged, testing the resolve of Margaret Thatcher's government and the nation itself. Argentina, under the military junta of General Galtieri, launched an invasion of the Falkland Islands, a remote British overseas territory in the South Atlantic. This act of aggression, occurring thousands of miles from the British mainland, caught many by surprise and ignited a fierce sense of national indignation. The initial reports of the invasion reached London, prompting immediate emergency meetings within government circles. Margaret Thatcher's response was swift and unequivocal. She declared that the invasion was an unacceptable act of aggression against British sovereign territory and that the islands must be liberated. There was no hesitation in her public pronouncements, nor in the operational decisions that followed. Within days, a formidable naval task force was assembled, comprising warships, troop carriers, and support vessels, preparing for a journey of over 8,000 miles. This rapid mobilization demonstrated a quiet determination to protect British interests and citizens, even at a significant logistical and military challenge. The decision to send such a force was a momentous one, carrying considerable risks, yet it was pursued with a focused resolve that permeated the government. The nation, initially stunned, rallied with a deep sense of unity behind the government's response. The conflict, though geographically distant, resonated with a powerful sense of national pride and a belief in the rightness of the cause. Public opinion largely supported the deployment of military force to reclaim the islands. This period witnessed a quiet but profound surge of patriotism, transcending typical political divisions. The ensuing conflict, lasting for 74 days, involved intense naval and ground engagements. British forces, operating under arduous conditions, demonstrated remarkable courage and professionalism. The loss of life on both sides was tragic, a solemn reminder of the human cost of conflict. Yet, the British military pressed forward with a singular purpose. By mid-June, British forces had successfully liberated the Falkland Islands, securing the surrender of the Argentine forces. The swift and decisive victory, achieved against considerable odds, significantly bolstered Margaret Thatcher's political standing and was widely seen as a vindication of her unwavering leadership during a moment of profound national crisis. It reinforced a perception of Britain's capacity for decisive action on the global stage, and for Margaret Thatcher, it became a defining moment of her premiership. The successful conclusion of the Falklands War in June 1982 brought with it a profound shift in the political landscape. The quiet triumph of the military campaign resonated deeply across the nation, fostering a renewed sense of confidence and pride. For Margaret Thatcher, who had demonstrated unwavering leadership throughout the conflict, this outcome translated into a significant surge in public approval. Her image as a strong, decisive leader, capable of defending national interests, was solidified in the public consciousness. Prior to the conflict, her government had faced considerable challenges, particularly concerning economic policy and rising unemployment. The initial years of her premiership had been marked by difficult decisions and often unpopular measures, leading to fluctuating approval ratings. However, the Falklands War served as a powerful unifying force, momentarily overshadowing domestic concerns and focusing national attention on a shared external objective. As the months passed after the victory, the atmosphere in Britain remained one of quiet satisfaction. The sense of national purpose and resilience evoked by the conflict continued to endure. Recognising this shift in public sentiment and the renewed strength of her position, Margaret Thatcher made the strategic decision to call a general election for June 1983, a year earlier than constitutionally required. The ensuing election campaign saw the Conservative Party, under her leadership, present a platform that emphasised strong defence, economic recovery, and a continuation of the policies initiated in her first term. The Labour Party, led by Michael Foot, struggled to present a coherent and compelling alternative, and its internal divisions were often apparent. The newly formed Social Democratic Party, SDP Liberal Alliance, also vied for support, but ultimately failed to gain significant traction. When the votes were counted, the result was a decisive victory for the Conservatives, as Margaret Thatcher secured a landslide majority, increasing her party's share of seats in the House of Commons significantly. This re-election was not merely a victory, it was a profound consolidation of her power and a clear mandate from the electorate to continue her transformative agenda. It marked a moment of quiet triumph, affirming her leadership and providing a powerful foundation for the challenging years that lay ahead. The nation had spoken, endorsing her vision for Britain's future. Following her substantial re-election, Margaret Thatcher's government soon faced its most profound industrial challenge, the year-long miners' strike, which began in March 1984. This was not merely a dispute over wages or working conditions. It became a defining struggle over the future of Britain's coal industry and, by extension, of the power of trade unions. The National Coal Board, the state-owned enterprise, announced plans to close unprofitable pits, a move seen by the National Union of Mine Workers, NUM, led by Arthur Scargill, as an existential threat to their industry and way of life. The strike quickly escalated, drawing in communities across the traditional coal fields. Its social and economic impact was immense, stretching far beyond the immediate workplaces. Families faced severe hardship, relying on charitable support and community solidarity to survive. Picket lines became sites of intense confrontation, often leading to clashes between striking miners and police forces. The images of these confrontations, broadcast across the nation, underscored the deep divisions that the strike was creating within British society. Throughout this prolonged battle, the government maintained a quiet yet unwavering determination. Drawing lessons from previous industrial disputes, particularly the 1970s, it had meticulously prepared. Strategic stockpiles of coal had been built up, and alternative energy sources were utilised to minimise the impact on electricity generation. The government also refused to intervene directly in negotiations, asserting that the dispute was a matter for the National Coal Board and the NUM. This stance was a deliberate departure from past practices, designed to weaken the union's leverage. As the months turned into a year, the strain on the striking miners and their families became unbearable. Despite their remarkable endurance and solidarity, the lack of a national ballot for the strike, coupled with the government's steadfast resolve and the growing economic hardship, began to erode the NUM's position. The strike eventually ended in March 1985, with the miners returning to work without an agreement. Their defeat marked a pivotal moment in British industrial history, significantly curtailing the power of trade unions and accelerating the decline of the coal industry, leaving behind a complex legacy of economic restructuring and deep-seated social scars. With the significant industrial conflicts largely behind her, Margaret Thatcher's government turned its attention more fully to another cornerstone of its economic philosophy, the policy of privatisation. This involved the quiet yet profound transfer of ownership of numerous state-owned industries and utilities into private hands. The rationale behind this ambitious program was multifaceted. Proponents argued that private ownership would foster greater efficiency, stimulate competition, and reduce the burden on the taxpayer. It was believed that private companies, driven by profit motives and market forces, would be more innovative and responsive to consumer needs than their state-controlled counterparts. The process began with the sale of British Telecom in 1984. a landmark event that introduced millions of ordinary citizens to share ownership. This was followed by a series of equally significant privatisations, including British Gas in 1986, British Airways, and later the water and electricity industries. Each sale was accompanied by public campaigns encouraging individuals to buy shares, aiming to create a share-owning democracy and deepen popular engagement with the market economy. These initiatives often saw substantial public uptake, demonstrating a widespread willingness to participate in this new economic landscape. The long-term impact of privatisation on the British economy was considerable and enduring. It fundamentally reshaped the structure of key sectors, introducing new competitive dynamics where state monopolies once existed. Advocates pointed to increased efficiency, improved services in some areas, and the substantial revenues generated for the Treasury, which were often used to fund tax cuts or reduce national debt. The policy also broadened the base of individual share ownership, albeit to varying degrees and with fluctuating long-term retention. However, the quiet transfer of ownership also sparked considerable debate. Critics raised concerns about the potential for natural monopolies to be replaced by private ones, the prioritising of profit over public service, and the impact on employment and working conditions in the privatised industries. Questions were also quietly posed about the long-term strategic implications of selling off national assets. Regardless of these differing perspectives, privatisation undeniably became one of the most distinctive and lasting legacies of the Thatcher era, fundamentally altering the relationship between the state, industry, and the individual in Britain, setting a new course for the nation's economic future. Even as the government pursued its ambitious economic agenda, the shadow of the ongoing conflict in Northern Ireland remained a persistent and often brutal reality. The tensions and violence that had long characterised the region continued to simmer, occasionally erupting into acts of profound destruction. It was against this backdrop that one of the most direct and personal threats to Margaret Thatcher and her administration unfolded. In the early hours of October 12, 1984, a devastating event occurred that underscored the relentless nature of the conflict. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, or IRA, detonated a bomb at the Grand Hotel in Brighton, where Margaret Thatcher and many members of her cabinet were staying for the Conservative Party conference. The explosion ripped through the building, causing extensive damage and claiming the lives of 5 individuals, including a Conservative Member of Parliament. Several others were seriously injured, and the Prime Minister herself narrowly escaped harm. The aftermath of the bombing presented a moment of profound challenge and potential disruption. Yet, in the immediate hours and days that followed, Margaret Thatcher exhibited a quiet defiance and remarkable resilience. Despite the shock and the clear personal danger she'd faced, her resolve appeared unwavering. She addressed the Conservative Party conference later that morning, delivering a speech that, while acknowledging the tragedy, firmly declared that the attempt to disrupt democracy and intimidate the government had failed. Her voice remained steady, her posture resolute, projecting an image of calm authority in the face of terror. This incident served to highlight the intensely personal nature of the threats faced by political leaders during periods of prolonged conflict. For Margaret Thatcher, the Brighton bombing was not merely an attack on her government, but a direct assault on her and her colleagues. Her response, characterised by a steadfast refusal to yield to intimidation, became another defining moment of her premiership. It reinforced her image as a leader who would not be swayed from her path, even in the most perilous circumstances, quietly asserting the enduring strength of the state against those who sought to undermine it through violence. As the 1980s progressed, Margaret Thatcher's government continued to engage with the evolving landscape of European cooperation. Despite her well-known skepticism about aspects of European integration, she played a significant, albeit complex, nursery role in a pivotal moment for the European community, the negotiation and signing of the Single European Act in 1986. This landmark agreement aimed to remove remaining barriers to trade and enhance the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people within the European community, effectively creating a true single market. For Margaret Thatcher, the prospect of a more open and competitive European market aligned with her own economic philosophies, which emphasised free trade and deregulation. She saw the potential for British businesses to thrive in a larger, less restrictive economic zone. Consequently, her government actively supported and contributed to the development of the Single European Act. However, even at this stage, a quiet tension regarding the future direction of Europe was beginning to emerge. While she embraced the economic advantages of the single market, Thatcher remained deeply wary of any initiatives that suggested a move towards greater political integration or a dilution of national sovereignty. Her vision of Europe was primarily an intergovernmental one, a collection of sovereign states cooperating on trade and specific shared interests, rather than a superstate. This nuanced position meant that while she championed the economic aspects of the Act, the seeds of future disagreements were quietly sown. Her pragmatic support for the single market existed alongside a growing unease about the broader ambitions of some European partners for a more politically unified continent. This evolving relationship with Europe, characterised by both collaboration and underlying apprehension, would become an increasingly prominent theme in the latter years of her premiership, reflecting a fundamental divergence in philosophy about the ultimate purpose and structure of the European project. The general election of 1987 saw Margaret Thatcher secure a third consecutive victory, a rare achievement in British political history. This result affirmed the electorate's continued endorsement of her leadership and the direction in which her government was taking the country. The Conservative Party won with a significant majority, allowing her to embark upon another term with a renewed mandate for her reform agenda. With this fresh mandate, the pace of change did not diminish. Her third term witnessed the continuation and expansion of policies that had already reshaped the British economic and social landscape. Privatisation, a hallmark of her second term, proceeded with further significant sales of state assets. Industries such as British Airways and British Airports Authority were transferred into private ownership, building upon the earlier privatisations of British Telecom and British Gas. These sales were driven by the consistent belief that private enterprise fostered greater efficiency, innovation, and responsiveness to consumer needs, simultaneously generating revenue for the Treasury. Beyond the realm of national industries, her government also turned its attention to the structure and funding of local government. A central tenet of Thatcherism was the desire to reduce the power of local authorities, particularly those perceived as being extravagant or ideologically opposed to central government policy. This led to various reforms aimed at curbing local government spending and increasing accountability. One notable initiative during this period was the introduction of compulsory competitive tendering, which required local councils to put many of their services out to tender, encouraging private companies to bid for contracts previously delivered by in-house departments. These changes reflected a sustained commitment to her core principles, diminishing the role of the state, fostering individual responsibility, and promoting market-based solutions. The third term, therefore, was not merely a period of maintenance, but an active continuation of the transformative project initiated in 1979, further embedding the principles of Thatcherism into the fabric of British governance and society. The depth and breadth of these reforms signalled a leader determined to complete her vision, even as new challenges and controversies began to gather on the horizon. Among the many reforms undertaken by Margaret Thatcher's government, one policy stands out as particularly divisive and ultimately pivotal: the introduction of the community charge, more commonly known as the poll tax. This new system for local government funding was implemented in Scotland in 1989 and across England and Wales in April 1990. It replaced the existing system of domestic rates, which had been based on the notional rental value of a property. The fundamental principle of the community charge was that every adult, regardless of their income or the value of their property, would pay a flat-rate tax towards local services. The rationale behind this policy, from the government's perspective, was to make local councils more accountable to their residents. It was argued that if every adult contributed directly, they would be more engaged in local spending decisions and would hold their councils more rigorously to account. This approach aligned with Thatcher's broader philosophy of individual responsibility and transparency in public finance. However, the practical application of the poll tax swiftly generated widespread opposition across the country. Critics argued that it was inherently unfair, disproportionately burdening lower-income households who would pay the same amount as wealthier individuals. The regressive nature of the tax sparked considerable public anger and led to widespread non-payment campaigns. Protests escalated, culminating in a large-scale demonstration in London in March 1990, which, regrettably, turned violent in some areas. The images of these confrontations further fueled public discontent and cemented the poll tax as a symbol of government insensitivity. The controversy surrounding the poll tax was not confined to the public sphere. It also began to create quiet, yet significant dissent within Margaret Thatcher's own Conservative Party. Many members of Parliament and party strategists grew increasingly concerned about the political damage the policy was inflicting. The deeply unpopular nature of the tax, coupled with its perceived unfairness, led some to question the Prime Minister's judgment and her willingness to listen to dissenting voices. This internal unease, though initially subdued, so steadily eroded the unity and loyalty that had long characterised her parliamentary support base. The poll tax, intended as a reform, instead became a focal point for growing discontent, both outside and, crucially, within the corridors of power. The internal dissent that had begun to simmer within the Conservative Party, particularly over the poll tax, gradually intensified and broadened. Beyond the specific grievances surrounding local government finance, a deeper sense of unease began to permeate the party. Some senior figures expressed quiet concerns about what they perceived as an increasingly autocratic style of leadership, a reluctance to engage in open debate, and an unwillingness to compromise on core policy positions. This erosion of support was not sudden, but rather a slow, almost imperceptible process. For many years, Margaret Thatcher had commanded immense loyalty, a testament to her electoral successes and her formidable resolve. However, the lengthy period in office, combined with a series of high-profile resignations and perceived slights, started to chip away at this foundation. Ministers like Nigel Lawson, her Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Sir Geoffrey Howe, her former Foreign Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, departed from her cabinet over policy disagreements, particularly concerning Britain's relationship with Europe and economic management. These departures, from individuals who had been close allies, sent subtle signals of growing fragmentation within the party's upper echelons. The moment of direct challenge arrived in November 1990. Sir Geoffrey Howe's resignation speech in the House of Commons, delivered with understated but devastating effect, proved to be a catalyst. His quiet critique of her European policy and his implied questioning of her leadership style provided the impetus for a formal challenge. Michael Heseltine, a charismatic and ambitious former Defence Secretary, who had resigned from the cabinet in 1986 over the Westland helicopter affair, stepped forward. Heseltine had long been seen as a potential rival, representing a more centrist, socially conscious wing of the Conservative Party. His decision to challenge Margaret Thatcher for the leadership was a direct manifestation of the deep divisions that had developed. The announcement of his candidacy initiated a leadership contest, a rare and significant event in British politics, signalling that her long reign was now facing its most serious internal threat. The quiet erosion of support had given way to an open struggle for the future direction of the party. The leadership contest, once initiated, unfolded with a swift and decisive momentum. In the initial ballot, Margaret Thatcher failed to secure the required margin for an outright victory. Although she received more votes than Michael Heseltine, the rules of the Conservative Party leadership election stipulated that a candidate needed not only a simple majority, but also a 15% lead over the second-place candidate. This outcome, falling short of the threshold, necessitated a second ballot. Between the first and second ballots, intense consultations took place within the Conservative Party. Her cabinet colleagues and senior backbenchers delivered a stark assessment. While she retained some personal loyalty, the party's electoral prospects under her continued leadership appeared diminished. The message conveyed was that despite her formidable will and past triumphs, the consensus within the parliamentary party had shifted. The quiet authority she'd wielded for so long was now being directly questioned by those who had served alongside her. Faced with this clear indication that she no longer commanded the full confidence of her party, Margaret Thatcher made the profound decision to resign. On the morning of November 22, 1990, she announced her intention to step down as Prime Minister and as leader of the Conservative Party. The announcement sent a ripple across the nation, marking an abrupt end to an 11-and-a-half-year premiership, a period of continuous leadership unmatched in the 20th century. Her final moments at 10 Downing Street were imbued with a quiet solemnity. As she prepared to leave for Buckingham Palace to tender her resignation to the Queen, a crowd of supporters and journalists gathered outside. Her departure from the iconic Black Door was marked by a poignant scene. Accompanied by her husband, Dennis, she paused briefly, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotion and resolve. A tear, uncharacteristic for her public persona, was observed, a rare glimpse into the personal cost of such a momentous decision. Stepping into the waiting car, she waved a final farewell to the assembled onlookers. The vehicle then proceeded slowly through the streets of London, carrying her away from the residence that had been the epicentre of her power for so long. Her quiet departure from Downing Street signified not merely the end of a political career, but the conclusion of a distinct era in British public life. The landscape of the nation had been undeniably reshaped during her time in office, and her exit marked a transition point, a quiet turning of a significant historical page. Following her resignation from the premiership, Margaret Thatcher did not immediately withdraw from political life. Instead, she transitioned to the role of a backbench Member of Parliament, representing the Finchley constituency, a seat she'd held since 1959. This return to the common benches of the House of Commons, after more than a decade at the apex of power, represented a significant adjustment. The routines of a backbencher were vastly different from the relentless demands and centralised authority of Downing Street. Her presence in Parliament, though no longer commanding the executive, remained notable. She continued to participate in debates, offering her perspectives on current affairs and often providing a quiet yet firm commentary on the direction of government policy. While her interventions were less frequent than in her prime ministerial years, they carried the weight of her extensive experience and her unwavering convictions. She remained a voice for the principles that had defined her leadership, often expressing concerns when she perceived a deviation from the economic and social policies she had championed. This period was characterised by a quiet recalibration of her public role, she no longer set the national agenda, nor did she hold the power to implement her vision directly. Her influence became more consultative, more reflective. She engaged in public speaking engagements, both domestically and internationally, sharing her insights on global politics and economic philosophy. These appearances allowed her to maintain a connection with public discourse, albeit from a different vantage point. The adjustment to life outside the constant glare of the premiership was gradual. The immediate demands of state had been replaced by a more personal schedule, though her commitment to public service remained evident. She quietly continued her work as a constituency MP, attending to the needs of her constituents, a fundamental duty that had been somewhat overshadowed during her time in high office, where this return to the foundational aspects of parliamentary life offered a different rhythm, a less prominent but still engaged involvement in the political fabric of the nation. It was a period of transition, where the formidable figure of the former Prime Minister adapted to a new, more reflective phase of her long and distinguished career. Following her departure from the front benches of Parliament, Margaret Thatcher dedicated a significant portion of her time to the meticulous task of writing her memoirs. This undertaking allowed her to provide her own account of the momentous events that had shaped her premiership, and indeed the nation during her tenure. The first volume, titled The Downing Street Years, was published in 1993. It offered a comprehensive narrative of her time as Prime Minister, detailing the major policy decisions, as the challenges faced and the philosophies that underpinned her actions. The writing process involved careful reflection, drawing upon her extensive personal papers and recollections to construct a detailed historical record from her unique perspective. This was followed by The Path to Power, released in 1995, which delved into her earlier life and political career, tracing her journey from her childhood in Grantham, through her education, her entry into Parliament, and her ascent to the leadership of the Conservative Party. These memoirs were not merely chronological accounts. They were also an articulation of her political philosophy, providing insight into the intellectual underpinnings of Thatcherism. They allowed her to consolidate her legacy in written form, offering a lasting testament to her beliefs and her understanding of the transformation she had sought to enact. Beyond her literary pursuits, Margaret Thatcher continued to engage with the public through various appearances and speeches. These engagements often took her to different parts of the world, where she was invited to share her perspectives on international relations, economic policy, and the principles of freedom and enterprise. Her presence, though no longer backed by the full machinery of state, still commanded attention. Her addresses were typically delivered with her characteristic conviction, reflecting her enduring commitment to the ideals she had espoused throughout her public life. These public engagements, whether at conferences, universities, or private gatherings, allowed her to maintain a connection with political discourse and to influence, albeit indirectly, contemporary debates. She remained a figure of considerable interest and respect, particularly among those who shared her conservative outlook. Her voice, though quieter than in her prime ministerial years, continued to resonate, offering a consistent and authoritative perspective on a range of issues. This period marked a transition from active governance to a role as a respected elder stateswoman, a chronicler of her own history and a consistent advocate for her enduring principles. In 1992, a significant transition occurred in Margaret Thatcher's parliamentary career. She was elevated to the House of Lords, taking the title of Baroness Thatcher of Kesteven. This peerage marked a new phase, moving her from the elected chamber of the House of Commons, where she'd served for over 3 decades, to the unelected upper chamber. The choice of Kesteven in her title was a nod to her roots, the historical administrative district in Lincolnshire where she was born and raised, subtly connecting her new status to her origins. Her entry into the House of Lords provided a different platform for her continued engagement with national affairs. While her role was no longer that of a government minister or a party leader, she remained a participant in legislative processes and political debate. The atmosphere of the House of Lords is distinct from the Commons, often characterised by a more deliberative and less confrontational style of discussion. Within this environment, Baroness Thatcher found a space to contribute her extensive experience and perspective. Her interventions in the House of Lords were generally measured and thoughtful. She would speak on matters of national importance, particularly those pertaining to economic policy, foreign affairs and constitutional issues, drawing upon her years at the helm of government. Although her voice in the upper chamber was quieter, less frequent, and arguably less immediately impactful than her pronouncements as Prime Minister, it still carried considerable weight. When Baroness Thatcher rose to speak, her words were listened to with respect, even by those who held differing political views. Her contributions often reflected her consistent belief in individual liberty, free markets, and a strong national defence. She did not seek to dominate debates or to lead opposition to government policy in the same assertive manner she had employed in the Commons. Instead, her presence was one of quiet authority, lending her experience to discussions and offering guidance based on her unique historical vantage point. The House of Lords allowed her to maintain a connection to the machinery of state, to observe and occasionally comment on the unfolding political landscape, without the intense pressures and partisan demands of frontline politics. It was a role that suited this later stage of her public life, enabling her to contribute wisdom and reflection rather than direct executive action. In June of 2003, a profound personal sorrow touched Margaret Thatcher's life with the passing of her beloved husband, Dennis Thatcher. Their partnership had spanned more than 5 decades, a constant and unwavering presence through all the tumultuous years of her political ascent and premiership. Dennis, with his steadfast loyalty, his dry wit, and his quiet support, had been her anchor, a source of unwavering encouragement and comfort. He had often been described as her greatest strength, a man content to remain in the background, yet always there, a solid foundation beneath the formidable public persona. The loss of Dennis was an immense personal blow to Margaret. Their shared life from their early days to the highest office had been a testament to a deep and enduring bond. For many years, Dennis had been a figure of stability, offering a unique perspective, often described as a sounding board for her thoughts and decisions, away from the intense glare of public scrutiny. His death removed a central pillar of her emotional world. Despite the profound grief, Margaret Thatcher displayed a quiet strength in the wake of her husband's passing. Those close to her observed a dignified composure during this difficult time. She attended the funeral service surrounded by family and friends, receiving condolences with her customary reserve and fortitude. While the private sorrow was undoubtedly deep, her public demeanour remained resolute, embodying the resilience that had defined much of her life. The period following Dennis's death marked a noticeable shift in her private life. The absence of her lifelong companion created a void that could not be filled. While she continued to engage in certain public activities, her focus increasingly turned inward. And her public appearances became less frequent. This personal loss underscored the human dimension of a figure often perceived primarily through the lens of her political achievements and controversies. It was a stark reminder that beneath the iron lady exterior lay a woman who experienced the profound human emotions of love, companionship, and ultimately bereavement. The enduring impact of Dennis's presence throughout her life was only fully revealed in the depth of her mourning for him. As the years progressed into the early 21st century, Margaret Thatcher's health began to decline, leading to a gradual and dignified withdrawal from the intense glare of public life. This period was marked by increasing frailty, particularly after she experienced a series of minor strokes. These health events, though not immediately debilitating, began to subtly affect her cognitive functions, especially her memory and speech. For a figure who'd been defined by her sharp intellect and formidable rhetorical abilities, these changes were significant. Her public appearances became less frequent, and when she did participate in events, her contributions were often shorter and more carefully managed. Her children, Mark and Carol, along with close aides, became increasingly protective of her privacy and well-being. The once tireless campaigner and formidable debater began to yield to the natural processes of aging, gradually receding from the public eye. This withdrawal was handled with a quiet dignity, reflecting her inherent sense of decorum and her family's desire to preserve her comfort and peace. She moved into a residence in Belgravia, London, where she could live with the necessary support and care. Her days became more structured around her personal needs, away from the demanding schedule that had characterized the vast majority of her adult life. Her public statements became rare, and her political interventions, once so frequent and impactful, largely ceased. The woman who had once dominated the political stage with an unyielding will now sought tranquility in her later years. This gradual retreat allowed for a more private existence, shielded from the constant scrutiny that had accompanied her extraordinary career. Her final years were characterized by a quiet presence, a dignified acceptance of her changing circumstances as she moved away from the spotlight that had illuminated her for so long. On the morning of April 8, 2013, the quiet passing of Margaret Thatcher occurred. She died peacefully at the Ritz Hotel in London following a stroke at the age of 87. The announcement of her death was made by her spokesman Lord Bell shortly after midday, informing the nation and the world of the end of a remarkable life. The news, though anticipated given her advanced age and declining health, resonated deeply across the United Kingdom and beyond. The immediate reaction was one of a quiet reflection, a moment for individuals to absorb the significance of her departure. The broadcast media quickly shifted its focus, presenting respectful tributes and recounting the monumental events of her political career. Flags were lowered to half-mast on government buildings, a customary mark of national mourning for a former Prime Minister. Prime Minister David Cameron, then on a visit to Madrid, promptly returned to London, cancelling scheduled engagements. He spoke of her as a Great Britain and expressed profound sadness at her passing. Similarly, messages of condolence and acknowledgement began to arrive from world leaders, past and present, recognising her indelible impact on global affairs. Across the United Kingdom, ordinary citizens reacted in various ways. For some, there was a sense of profound loss, an acknowledgement of a leader who had profoundly shaped their lives and the nation's trajectory. For others, particularly those who had opposed her policies, there was a more complex reaction. But even among critics, there was often an underlying recognition of her strength and conviction. The days that followed were characterized by a period of national contemplation, whilst television documentaries and newspaper analyses revisited her premiership, examining her policies, her triumphs, and the controversies that had defined her time in office. The immediate aftermath of her death thus became a time for the nation to quietly, and sometimes intensely, reflect upon the legacy of the woman known as the Iron Lady, allowing for a collective moment of historical appraisal before the preparations for her ceremonial farewell began. The news of Margaret Thatcher's passing elicited a spectrum of national reactions, revealing the enduring and often contradictory nature of her impact on British society. While official statements and many public figures offered effusive praise for her leadership and vision, a more complex picture emerged across the country. For many, particularly within the Conservative Party, and those who felt their lives had improved under her government, Her death was met with profound sadness and a deep sense of loss. They remembered her as a strong, resolute leader who had restored Britain's standing on the world stage and revitalised its economy. Tribute spoke of her courage, her conviction, and her unwavering determination to implement policies she believed were right for the nation, regardless of their popularity. For these individuals, her funeral was an occasion for respectful remembrance and gratitude. However, the national reaction was not uniformly mournful. In certain communities, particularly those profoundly affected by industrial decline and social upheaval during her premiership, her death was met with a different kind of response. There were instances of quiet protest, and in some areas, even celebrations. These reactions stemmed from deeply held grievances and memories of policies that, for many, had led to job losses, community breakdown, and a sense of disenfranchisement. The divisions she had inspired during her life resurfaced, illustrating that while she was a figure of immense historical significance, her legacy remained contested. The contrasting public sentiments underscored the extent to which Margaret Thatcher had polarised opinion throughout her time in public life. She was a leader who inspired both fierce loyalty and fervent opposition, and her passing did not erase these deeply ingrained perspectives. Instead, it brought them to the surface, allowing for a multifaceted national conversation about her place in British history. This divided farewell served as a powerful testament to the transformative and often disruptive nature of her leadership, confirming that her impact was too profound to be met with a single, unified emotion. On the 17th of April, 2013, the United Kingdom bid its formal farewell to Margaret Thatcher with a ceremonial funeral, complete with full military honours at St Paul's Cathedral. The decision for such an event, falling short of a state funeral but still of considerable national significance, reflected her unique status as a towering figure in 20th century British politics. The day itself was marked by a quiet solemnity. The streets of London, from Westminster to St Paul's, were lined with a mixture of mourners, onlookers, and a small number of silent protesters. The coffin, draped in the Union flag, was borne on a gun carriage through the hushed thoroughfares, a procession accompanied by the steady rhythmic beat of muffled drums and the precise movements of servicemen and women from all branches of the armed forces. This display of military precision and tradition underscored the dignity and gravity of the occasion. Inside St Paul's Cathedral, the atmosphere was one of quiet contemplation. Dignitaries from around the world, including current and former heads of state, joined members of the royal family, British political figures, and those who had worked closely with her. The service itself was a traditional Anglican ceremony, featuring hymns and readings that spoke of duty, faith, and the passage of life. The eulogy, delivered by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, alongside a reading by her granddaughter, offered reflections on her life, her achievements, and the indelible mark she left on the nation. The proceedings unfolded with an understated grace, devoid of overt political rhetoric, focusing instead on remembrance and respect. The quiet dignity of the occasion, set against the grandeur of St Paul's, provided a final formal tribute to a woman whose life had been anything but quiet, yet whose final journey was conducted with a measured calm. In the immediate aftermath of Margaret Thatcher's passing, and following the solemnity of her funeral, a period of intensified historical assessment began to unfold. Scholars, commentators, and public figures alike engaged in a concerted effort to contextualise her premiership, seeking to understand the enduring implications of her policies and the complex tapestry of her legacy. The initial analyses frequently grappled with the profound societal shifts that occurred under her leadership. Economic reforms, particularly the privatisation of state-owned industries and the deregulation of financial markets, were scrutinised for their long-term effects on employment, wealth distribution, and the structure of the British economy. Historians sought to trace the origins of these policies, connecting them to the intellectual currents of the time and the perceived failures of post-war consensus politics. Her confrontation with trade unions, most notably during the miners' strike, was re-examined through various lenses, considering its impact on industrial relations and the balance of power within British society. The Falklands War, a defining moment of her time in office, Arvoyant was revisited to assess its role in shaping national identity and international standing. These events, often viewed as discrete episodes, were now increasingly framed as interconnected components of a broader ideological project, collectively known as Thatcherism. Attempts were made to move beyond the immediate emotional reaction stirred by her death, striving for a more dispassionate evaluation. This process involved sifting through archival material, memoirs, and contemporary reports, seeking to construct a comprehensive narrative that acknowledged both the intended and unintended consequences of her actions. The initial historical assessment, therefore, became a complex exercise in balancing the dramatic impact of her decisions with the long-term, often subtle, transformations they engendered across the fabric of British life. The economic transformation initiated during the Thatcher era left an indelible mark on the British landscape, quietly reshaping the nation's financial and industrial foundations for decades to come. Central to this monumental shift was the policy of privatisation, a deliberate dismantling of state ownership that had characterised much of post-war Britain. Industries such as British Telecom, British Airways, British Gas and British Steel, once under public control, were transferred to private hands. This was presented as a means to foster greater efficiency, encourage competition, and broaden share ownership among the general public, drawing millions into the stock market for the first time with campaigns like Tell Sid. Alongside privatisation, deregulation played a pivotal role. Financial markets, in particular, experienced significant loosening of controls famously encapsulated by the Big Bang of 1986. This event dramatically altered the London Stock Exchange, removing fixed commissions and opening up the city's financial sector to international competition and innovation. The aim was to enhance London's position as a global financial hub, attracting investment and fostering a more dynamic, market-driven economy. These shifts profoundly impacted Britain's traditional heavy industries. Coal mining, shipbuilding, and manufacturing, which had long been cornerstones of regional economies and sources of collective identity, faced intense pressure. The government's stance on industrial disputes, coupled with global economic changes, led to significant closures and a dramatic decline in these sectors. This left many communities grappling with high unemployment and the loss of long-established ways of life, necessitating a difficult transition towards new forms of employment and economic activity. The quiet reshaping of the British economy was therefore a dual process. On one hand, fostering growth in new sectors like finance and services, and on the other, overseeing the managed decline of older, less competitive industries. This era fundamentally altered the relationship between the state and the economy, placing greater emphasis on market forces and individual enterprise. The long-term consequences of these economic changes continue to be debated and analysed, forming a crucial part of Margaret Thatcher's enduring legacy. The social impact of Margaret Thatcher's time in power was as profound as the economic shifts, fostering an emphasis on individualism that quietly challenged traditional community structures across Britain. Her philosophy often underscored personal responsibility and self-reliance, encapsulated in statements that suggested there was no such thing as society, only individuals and their families. This perspective, while intended to empower individuals, was perceived by some as undermining the collective bonds and shared welfare that had long characterised British society. The decline of heavy industries, a direct consequence of her economic policies, had a particularly significant social dimension. Mining communities, shipbuilding towns and industrial areas, once vibrant centres of collective identity and mutual support, experienced the erosion of their traditional livelihoods. With the closure of pits and factories, not only jobs but also the social networks, shared histories and cultural institutions that revolved around these industries began to diminish. This left many communities grappling with a sense of loss and fragmentation, as the very fabric of their communal existence was quietly altered. The expansion of home ownership and the promotion of private enterprise, while offering new opportunities for some, also contributed to a shifting social landscape. The aspiration to own one's home and to build personal wealth became more pronounced, potentially altering priorities from collective welfare to individual advancement. These changes sparked enduring debates that continue to resonate within British society. Questions arose and continue to arise about the balance between individual liberty and collective responsibility, of the role of the state in supporting vulnerable communities, and the very nature of British identity in an increasingly market-driven world. The social legacy of the Thatcher years is thus a complex tapestry, woven with threads of aspiration, dislocation, and a persistent re-evaluation of what it means to belong to a community. Margaret Thatcher's quiet but profound transformation of the Conservative Party stands as one of her most enduring political legacies. Before her ascent, the party often embraced a more paternalistic one-nation conservatism, marked by a degree of consensus with the prevailing post-war social democratic settlement. Thatcher, however, steered it towards a distinctly different philosophical path. She instilled within the party a deep-seated commitment to free market principles, a scepticism towards state intervention, and a robust defence of individual liberty. This ideological shift, often referred to as Thatcherism, became the new orthodoxy for many within the Conservative ranks. The emphasis moved away from grand collective schemes and towards the belief in the power of markets and entrepreneurial spirit to drive national prosperity. Her leadership effectively purged certain elements of the older, more moderate conservatism, establishing a new set of core tenets that would define the party for decades. Successive Conservative leaders, even those who sought to soften the edges of her policies, found themselves operating within the framework she'd established. The arguments for lower taxes, reduced public spending, deregulation, and a strong national defence became foundational elements of the party's platform. Even in opposition, and certainly in government, the Conservative Party continued to grapple with her shadow. Debates within the party often revolved around how closely to adhere to her principles, or how to adapt them to new circumstances, rather than a wholesale rejection of her vision. Her quiet influence shaped not only policy, but also the very language and intellectual landscape of modern British conservatism, ensuring that her ideological footprint remained deeply embedded in its institutional memory and future direction. This deep, quiet transformation continues to inform the party's identity and its approach to governance even today. On the international stage, Margaret Thatcher cultivated a quiet but firm presence, becoming a globally recognised figure whose influence extended far beyond Britain's borders, particularly during the complex years of the Cold War. Her tenure coincided with a critical phase of East-West relations, and her approach was characterised by a resolute anti-communism coupled with a pragmatic willingness to engage when opportunities arose. One of the defining relationships of her time in office was with United States President Ronald Reagan. Their shared conservative ideology, firm belief in free markets, and unwavering stance against the Soviet Union forged a powerful alliance. They spoke a similar political language, often finding common ground in their conviction that Western strength, both economic and military, was essential for confronting the Soviet threat. This transatlantic partnership was a significant force in Cold War diplomacy, providing a unified front that projected strength and resolve. Beyond the alliance with America, Thatcher also played a unique role in encouraging dialogue with the Soviet Union. While publicly maintaining a tough stance, she was notably one of the first Western leaders to recognize the potential for reform within the Soviet system, particularly in her early interactions with Mikhail Gorbachev. Her quiet assessment of him as a man we can do business with foreshadowed the later thawing of relations and the eventual end of the Cold War. This nuanced approach demonstrated a capacity for both unwavering principle and strategic engagement. Her presence in international forums, from G7 summits to Commonwealth meetings, was consistently marked by a calm assertiveness. She advocated for British interests with clarity and conviction, never shying away from expressing her views, or even when they diverged from those of her counterparts. This firm resolve, combined with her intellectual rigour, solidified her reputation as a formidable global leader, one whose impact on the unfolding narrative of the late 20th century was undeniable. The moniker Iron Lady, bestowed upon Margaret Thatcher by a Soviet journalist, quickly became synonymous with her public image, encapsulating a perception of unyielding strength and unwavering resolve. This title, initially intended as a criticism, was quietly embraced and ultimately defined much of how she was viewed both at home and abroad. It spoke to a certain imperviousness, a steadfastness in the face of opposition that resonated deeply with her political style. Beneath this formidable public persona, however, lay a quiet, relentless determination. It was not a performative strength, but rather an ingrained quality that had been evident throughout her life, from her early academic pursuits to her ascent in a male-dominated political arena. Her strength was often manifested not through bombast, but through meticulous preparation, an unwavering commitment to her convictions, and a singular focus on achieving her objectives. She approached policy decisions with a lawyer's precision and a scientist's methodical inquiry, ensuring that her positions were thoroughly considered and robustly defended. The Iron Lady was not merely a creation of the media. It reflected a fundamental aspect of her character. It was the quiet courage to stand firm against powerful unions, the resolute will to reclaim the Falkland Islands, and the steadfast adherence to her economic principles despite widespread dissent. This inner fortitude allowed her to navigate immense pressures and make difficult, often unpopular decisions. While the public image suggested an almost unshakable exterior, the reality was a deeply held belief in her vision and an immense capacity for work, driven by a quiet, unyielding sense of purpose that propelled her through the most challenging periods of her premiership. The legacy of Margaret Thatcher remains, even decades later, a subject of intense and often fervent debate, a testament to the profound and polarizing impact of her time in office. Her name continues to evoke strong reactions, both admiration and censure, depending on the perspective from which her policies and leadership are viewed. There is no singular, universally accepted narrative of her premiership, nor is there a quiet consensus on her ultimate place in British history. For some, she's remembered as a visionary leader who rescued Britain from economic decline, restoring national pride and unleashing entrepreneurial spirit. They point to the revitalisation of industries, the curbing of union power, and the assertion of Britain's standing on the world stage as evidence of her transformative success. From this viewpoint, her actions, though sometimes harsh, were necessary to dismantle an unsustainable status quo and lay the foundations for future prosperity. Conversely, for others, her era is recalled as a period of deep social division, increased inequality, and the erosion of traditional communities. Critics highlight the rise in unemployment, particularly in the industrial heartlands, the perceived dismantling of the welfare state, and the social costs associated with her radical economic restructuring. They argue that her policies, while beneficial for some, left many behind, creating lasting scars on the social fabric of the nation. These differing perspectives are not easily reconciled, nor are they likely to fade with time. History's judgment, particularly for figures as transformative as Margaret Thatcher, is rarely simple or quiet. It is a continuous process of re-evaluation, informed by new evidence, evolving societal values, and the shifting lenses through which the past is interpreted. Her story is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of triumph and tribulation, progress and pain, ensuring that the debate surrounding her will continue to echo through the corridors of British memory for generations to come. As the narrative of Margaret Thatcher's long and impactful life gently draws to its close, we are left with a quiet sense of the enduring ripples she created across the fabric of history. Her journey, from a grocer's daughter in Grantham to the highest office in the land, was a testament to an unwavering conviction and an immense, quiet will. She arrived on the political stage with a clear vision, a deep-seated belief in individual liberty and free markets, and the resolute determination to reshape a nation according to those principles. Her life was an embodiment of a force that, once set in motion, was difficult to deflect. Through periods of intense challenge and profound change, she maintained a steadfastness that became her defining characteristic. It was a strength born not of bluster, but of meticulous preparation, deep intellectual engagement with her chosen path, and an unshakable inner certainty. This quiet conviction allowed her to navigate turbulent waters, make difficult decisions, and endure the often fierce opposition that met her transformative agenda. The echoes of her time in power continue to resonate across the political, economic and social landscapes of Britain and beyond. Her policies and philosophy fundamentally altered the course of the Conservative Party, leaving an imprint that remains visible today. The historical conversation about her impact, therefore, is not a closed book, but an ongoing dialogue. It is a quiet echo in the annals of time, a continuous process of understanding, debate, and reflection. Her story reminds us that the legacies of truly transformative figures are rarely simple, nor are they ever truly finished. They continue to unfold, subtly shaping the present and influencing the future, long after their active presence has receded into the quiet depths of history.